This is Unsung History, the podcast where we discuss people and events in American history that haven't always received a lot of attention. I'm your host, Kelly Therese Pollock. I'll start each episode with a brief introduction to the topic, and then talk to someone who knows a lot more than I do. Be sure to subscribe to Unsung History on your favorite podcasting app so you never miss an episode. And please, tell your friends, family, neighbors, colleagues, maybe even strangers to listen to. Ryan Wayne White was born on December 6, 1971, in Kokomo, Indiana. His mother, Jeannie, bled profusely after the delivery. And when Ryan was circumcised, he too bled profusely. A hematologist at Methodist Hospital in Indianapolis, where Ryan was transported, diagnosed him with classic or severe hemophilia. Although for previous generations, treating complications from hemophilia had usually meant hospitalization, Ryan was born late enough that many of his bleeding episodes could be treated with at-home shots of factor VIII injections that doctors authorized for him by the time he turned 5, and Jeannie learned to give him. Many people with hemophilia, including Ryan, saw factor VIII as a lifeline. Ryan called it Old Faithful. The downside of this lifeline was that it pooled blood and plasma from thousands of donors, dramatically increasing the user's risk of exposure to diseases like hepatitis B and HIV. But in the early 1980s, the National Hemophilia Foundation, deciding the risks of such exposure didn't outweigh the benefits of using factor VIII injections, advised people with hemophilia to, quote, maintain the use of concentrate, unquote. And folks like Ryan did. In the summer of 1984, Ryan was 12 and a half years old and living with his mother after her second divorce, when he began to feel constantly ill, with night sweats, lethargy, and stomach cramps. By December, when he couldn't even get off the school bus without feeling tired, and one weekend ran a fever of 104 degrees, Jeannie took him to the hospital, where x-rays showed that he had pneumonia in both lungs. A course of antibiotics failed to treat the pneumonia. At Riley Hospital for Children in Indianapolis, Dr. Martin Kleiman suspected AIDS, and a biopsy of the lungs revealing pneumocystis carinii pneumonia, PCP, confirmed his suspicion. Ryan was too sick to return to school that academic year, but he hoped to go back to Western Middle School in Rushville, Indiana, in fall of 1985. However, on July 30th, 1985, J.O. Smith, the superintendent of the Western School Corporation, WSC, said that Ryan could not attend because he was living with AIDS. That decision and the ensuing legal battle by the White family would lead to national media coverage and would confer a type of celebrity status on Ryan. For months, Ryan was forced to attend courses remotely, which in 1985 meant over a landline telephone. In February 1986, he was able to attend courses in person for a single day. But 42% of the students stayed home because of fears that they would catch AIDS from Ryan, and their parents convinced a judge to issue a temporary injunction to prevent Ryan from attending classes in person. Finally, in August 1986, Ryan started 8th grade at Western High School. After a difficult year there, though, the White family moved to Cicero, Indiana, 30 miles from Kokomo. Elton John, who would later credit his friendship with the White family with convincing him to get sober and ultimately saving his life, helped Jeannie purchase the home in Cicero. In June of 1987, years into the AIDS epidemic, President Ronald Reagan issued Executive Order 12601, creating the President's Commission on the HIV epidemic. Ryan testified before the commission in Washington, D.C. on March 3, 1988. In January 1989, a made-for-TV movie called The Ryan White Story debuted on ABC. An estimated 15 million people watched the movie, which told the story of Ryan's expulsion from middle school and his family's legal battle. Upon the release of the film, residents of Kokomo felt that they'd been unfairly maligned, and the town's mayor received a deluge of critical mail. In late March 1990, Ryan visited Southern California, attending a pre-Oscar party, and then, with former President Ronald Reagan, announcing the creation of the Ryan White National Program for AIDS Education, an initiative of athletes and entertainers for kids. Shortly afterward, he felt very ill and returned to Indiana, where he was quickly hospitalized at Riley. Ryan White died on April 8th, 1990, with his mom, his sister Andrea, and Elton John at his side. He was 18 years old, just a month shy of graduating from high school. 1,500 mourners attended Ryan's nationally televised April 11th funeral at Second Presbyterian Church in Indianapolis, including Elton John, First Lady Barbara Bush, Howie Long, and Phil Donahue. Senator Ted Kennedy had introduced the Comprehensive AIDS Resources Emergency Act, or the CARE Act, in the Senate in early March 1990. The bill had already had 25 co-sponsors, in large part due to the relentless efforts of AIDS activists throughout the late 1980s. The formal report of the Senate Labor and Human Resources Committee was published several weeks after Ryan's death and dedicated in his honor, noting that Ryan, quote, introduced to people across America and across the world a face of AIDS that caring human beings could not turn their back upon, unquote. With Ryan's name attached, the Ryan White Comprehensive AIDS Resources Emergency Act of 1990 passed the Senate on May 16th and the House on June 13th. After reconciliation between the two versions, President George H.W. Bush signed the bill into law on August 18th, 1990, even though he opposed the disease-specific approach. By September of that year, though, in the midst of budget battles, the Senate Appropriations Subcommittee on Labor, Health, and Human Services had funded only 110 million of the nearly 900 million authorized by the bill. It wouldn't be fully funded until 1994. HIV/AIDS remains a public health threat. According to the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, approximately 1.2 million people in the United States have HIV, about 13% of whom do not know it. Joining me in this episode is Dr. Paul Renfro, Associate Professor of History at Florida State University and author of The Life and Death of Ryan White, AIDS and Inequality in America. First, though, is a clip of an interview I did with actress Alyssa Milano for the Two Broads Talking Politics podcast in July of 2019, where she discusses when she met Ryan White, an event that sparked the beginning of her political activist work.
So it was during the 80s, and I was on a show called Who's the Boss, which was a top 10 show at the time. And so I became sort of like a teen pop icon. And it was kind of a weird existence, obviously being a teenager and having some sense of celebrity and being famous. And I was really awkward. It was a tough thing to navigate as a young person. And one day I got a phone call from Elton John, just to give you a little idea of how crazy my life was. And this was during the time when he was doing a lot of work for AIDS and really advocating. And, it was also the time when during, the 80s, there was a lot of stigma attached to having HIV/AIDS. And basically, the government, those with different ideologies, basically fed into every fear that we had about what this disease could potentially be and how you get it. And it was just really horrible. Elton introduced me to a little boy named Ryan White. And Ryan was HIV positive, and he'd been thrown out of his school because they said that, he could give AIDS just from casual contact. And he fought for his right to go back to school and won, and he spoke in front of Congress, and he really started to really shift this narrative around what it meant to be HIV positive. And he had asked me one day if I would go on TV and kiss him on TV to prove that you could not get HIV/AIDS from casual contact. And so at the height of, my sort of popularity and the height of the stigma surrounding HIV/AIDS, I went on the Phil Donahue show and kissed Ryan to prove that you could not get HIV/AIDS from casual contact. And it was a monumental thing for me because it really put in perspective what it meant to be an actor and to have a platform. And from that moment on, I knew that this is what I wanted to do and that I was going to use my voice in whatever way I could and whatever opportunities I had to affect positive change.
Hi, Paul. Thanks so much for joining me today.
Thank you for having me. I really appreciate it.
Yes, I'm really happy to be talking to you about this book. I want to start by asking what got you interested in writing this book. I think it's your second book. So how you came to write this story.
Right. So this is a story that's loomed over my life, and probably the way in which I first learned about HIV and AIDS, I probably don't remember all that clearly, but Ryan died when I was 2.5, and his story lived on throughout the 90s and became this example of AIDS education and a way in which people could talk about AIDS and tolerance, I think, in ways that were maybe appealing to a broad swath of the American public. And so I wanted to explore some of those themes and the the way in which he was understood to be the innocent or more acceptable face of HIV and AIDS. And as a queer person, I recognize the ways in which that sort of language can be weaponized and how harmful it can be. And I'm fascinated. My first book dealt also with the theme of innocence and victimhood, and I'm just fascinated by that theme and how American politics, not just American politics, but I think it's quite prevalent in American politics, how it is predicated on notions of innocence and how that drives certain policy decisions, certain assumptions are kind of embedded into certain policies, and those rest on ideas of innocence, which, of course, are racialized and have gender specific and other sorts of connotations. So that's really what brought me to the book. I'm very lucky to have a job where I can write about kind of what I want to write about. And, that's less true for the first book, but for the second book, I had a great deal of freedom and latitude. So this is a story that's always intrigued me and one that I really wanted to tackle.
Could you talk a little bit about how you chose to frame the book? It's not a biography of Ryan White. There are biographical elements, but how you decided sort of what the focus and the framing of the story would be.
Yeah. So, yeah, there are biographical elements, and the first chapter is probably the most biographical, but I wanted it to be sort of a meditation on innocence and a discussion or an analysis of how Ryan's story fit into the politics of the moment, how it fit into or intersected with or diverged from the HIV/AIDS movement, the activities of ACT UP. And I'm a political historian and a cultural historian, and so I'm interested in how narratives get formed, how they are deployed in different contexts, and I wanted to really highlight that narrative, the Ryan White story, how it was constructed, the assumptions embedded within it, and different elements of that story and how it had an impact on all people living with HIV and AIDS, and more broadly the American public, and really people beyond the U.S. How they grappled with HIV and AIDS, and how the figure of Ryan White enabled them to elaborate certain narratives or to articulate certain thoughts that may have been unspoken or may have been spoken in different ways without that figure or without that sort of symbol. So, yeah, I wanted to, what's interesting about Ryan is, he had interiority, but so much of his story was filtered through and mediated by politicians, news media, the American public more broadly. So he really became whatever people wanted him to be. And that's kind of how I set out to write it, right? I kind of wanted to go through these different narratives or these different approaches to Ryan's story and the different deployments or uses of the story, and some would say the abuses of those stories or that story. So yeah, that's kind of what led me to structure it in this particular way. It's roughly chronological, but also it's focused on different themes and different ideas and expressions within and of that story.
So Ryan was quite literally a poster child before he even was diagnosed with HIV. And so his life in many ways was never quite we're going to talk a lot about normal and what normal means, but his life in some ways was never quite normal. Could you talk a little bit about that and how that shapes his reaction, perhaps his mom's reaction to when he does get HIV and the way they're approaching dealing with this disease?
Right. So Ryan had hemophilia, severe hemophilia, and he benefited in some ways, and obviously not in others, from the post World War II boom in medical research that led to the development and growing availability of things like factor VIII, which enabled people with hemophilia to inject themselves rather than going to inject themselves with this clotting factor that could help in the event of bleeding episode, right? Rather than going to the hospital, spending long periods in the hospital, which he still did. He was a very sickly child, but that status as someone with hemophilia, I think, primed both Ryan and his mother and people around him, and more generally, people, who would learn about his story later. It primed them to discuss him in a particular way and to discuss his disability and later interlocking disabilities in very specific ways. So he became courageous. And I'm not saying that he was not courageous. It's just that in these dominant narratives, he became sickly, he became courageous, he became also very resilient. And so with hemophilia, all of these narratives were already sort of baked in, right? Or they had been refined through his bout with hemophilia. And of course, it's his use of factor VIII that leads to his HIV diagnosis. And there's obviously a direct relationship there. And I think there's a direct relationship as well between the way in which he and his mother understood his disability, that is his hemophilia, and how that allowed them to talk about HIV and AIDS. Essentially, this is something that can be tackled through a positive attitude. It can be tackled through kind of, resilience. It can be tackled through ambition and sort of not ambition, but kind of a bold approach to life, kind of grabbing the bull by the horns, right? There's an anecdote in the book in which Jeannie White, Ryan's mother, indicates that she would not put a helmet on him when he was a child, right? That's sometimes encouraged, or at least it was, for folks with hemophilia, for children with hemophilia, given the potential severity of an injury, right, to the head that might lead to substantial bleeding and obviously complications. She indicated, okay, if that would maybe teach him that he is different, that he's potentially kind of weak in a way. And so there's a conscious rejection of that and a conscious rejection of disability that shape their response to hemophilia and subsequently to their response to HIV and AIDS. And there's also a conscious rejection of Ryan as disabled in the ways in which other children are disabled. So I sense this sort of effort to not necessarily rank or situate Ryan above individuals with more severe disabilities, but there was a kind of distancing detected in a lot of their writing or a lot of their rhetoric concerning his stints in the hospital. Basically, the idea being, well, I'm not as disabled as other people. And that is also kind of shaping how they're approaching HIV and AIDS. And the implication is, you can't sort of, or you shouldn't necessarily fully embrace or spotlight, all of the ills that are facing you if you have HIV and AIDS or if you have hemophilia. Basically, count your blessings, which can be positive, but also it's this very individualized narrative or approach to disability, one that obscures structural factors, these other forces that might render some individuals more susceptible to certain disabilities, illnesses, but also the effects of those. So I talk a little bit about how those narratives intersect with these broader sort of neoliberal narratives about disability and about rehabilitation and about kind of self-management. And it's largely in chapter 1, but I think it also shapes how people talk about Ryan and how they view him as this exceptional person and an exceptional person with AIDS, And that only kind of serves to place him at the top of what Anthony Petro calls the hierarchy of victimhood within the HIV and AIDS crisis.
So I'm old enough to have remembered, at least somewhat have been aware of the Ryan White story being in the news. And I know from the study of history about the failure of the government to respond to the AIDS crisis. But one thing in this story that was completely shocking to me was the failure of the FDA to respond in the early 80s, like 82 to 84, when there was the ability to screen for HIV in the blood supply, and was not done. So people like Ryan White, other people with hemophilia, may not have needed to have been infected at all. Could you talk a little bit about that and the blood industry, so to speak, the failures there, and what the sorts of things that could have been prevented, and the incentives that were going on?
Right. So there was this strange sort of tension between, and I think this kind of goes to your question about normality as well, this tension between this desire for people with hemophilia to be normal, but also this recognition that they were perhaps quite vulnerable and when it came to infectious diseases in the blood supply. So even before HIV became this major threat within the blood supply, people with hemophilia were particularly susceptible to hepatitis, I believe hepatitis B. And immediately before Ryan was diagnosed with AIDS in December of 1984, he was diagnosed with hepatitis, I believe hepatitis B. So there is this kind of perverse incentive to almost not acknowledge that because of the conveniences afforded by factor eight, some of which I alluded to earlier, the ability of people with hemophilia to live quote unquote normal lives, right? And that almost precludes a larger sort of discussion or the discussion about and reckoning with the reality that this is going to infect a lot of people and kill a lot of people, which is precisely what happened. So, and yes, there are these perverse financial incentives as well. These private entities are unwilling to sort of acknowledge the threat. And some of this is also enabled by hemophilia advocacy organizations, which have this sort of interest in maintaining this allure of or veneer of normality, and almost sort of refusing to acknowledge the grave threat that is posed by HIV in the blood supply. So yeah, I actually didn't know much about this before I started the research for this book. I had no clue that the blood supply was not really inspected, was not heat treated until the mid 80s or so. And there's an interesting sort of, I mean, we've talked a little bit about blame already and innocence and guilt, but the kind of act of banning so-called gay blood, you know, almost serves as a way to divert blame and to say, well, yes, there are all these institutional failures, this failure to reckon with this tremendous threat. Well, we might as well just blame gay people for it, or to say, you know, that is our effort to sort of cover our own asses and to, you know, to make amends for something that could have been prevented from the outset. And of course, there were tremendous uncertainties and a general lack of understanding when it came to HIV and AIDS. And I would suggest that many of those persist to this day. But I think that most people would recognize that, yeah, there's the potential for, and people were talking about it then. They were saying there is the potential for infection, for mass infection, because of these technologies, which, yes, have afforded people to live lives that might resemble the lives of so-called ordinary Americans, but that also it posed tremendous risks. And yeah, I mean, thousands of lives were shaped and destroyed because of it.
You talk a lot in the book about the ways that Ryan's story helps bring attention and sympathy to the AIDS crisis, brings some political attention eventually as he's dying. But at the same time, of course, the way that he is posed as this innocent victim, it makes other people who are living with AIDS seem, guilty by comparison, maybe less worthy of care. So could you talk a little bit about that, sort of the hazards of respectability politics and the very complicated thing that is going on here where, especially for AIDS activism groups, they certainly want the resources and the help of the government, but it's putting them in an awkward position if they are being looked at as less worthy than a person like Ryan White.
Right. Yeah. And it's really, I think, complex. And I'm teaching a class on HIV and AIDS right now, the history of HIV and AIDS specifically in the US context. And we've read some of the chapters from my book, and students struggle with it too. And I like to, I think it's an interesting sort of intellectual exercise to say, okay, well, what can we learn from this story and how it was deployed both in the service of awareness, but also in the service of reinforcing hierarchies that existed before, or maybe even sort of creating new ones. Yeah, I think it definitely put, as you indicated, groups like ACT UP and others in a very awkward position. And I didn't find in the historical record, and I'm sure we'll talk about the CARE Act in a second, but much evidence of these organizations piping up when Ryan was being floated as the potential namesake for the Comprehensive AIDS Resources Emergency Act. And I have to think that was strategic, but it's telling because he was so unassailable in a way. And it's telling because you would think that given a lot of the approaches and stances of these organizations like ACT UP, which was very forward thinking on needle exchanges, very forward thinking in terms of including people of color and women, drawing on not just the civil rights movement, the African American freedom struggle, but also particular strands of feminism. I mean, there were communists in ACT UP. I mean, there were all these different groups and entities. So, I have to think that silence was strategic, but also it was something that was controversial within the ranks of ACT UP. So, yeah, I mean, the very notion of innocence, I think some news media outlets, some politicians who were sympathetic to the cause of AIDS activism, the causes, they maybe eschewed that kind of language, but even within other phrases they might use, such as through no fault of his own, or I mean, that's the main one that appeared throughout newspaper articles and the congressional record, et cetera. But yeah, through no fault of his own, I think does the same sort of work that Innocent does, where it says, well, folks who are, and basically it's just reinforcing stigmas attached to certain behaviors or attached to certain identities, as if, engaging in anal sex or using intravenous drugs should subject you to death, right? But that's the implication, even if it is unstated. And a lot of this is also obviously racial, even though, and I mentioned this in the introduction, Ryan White is very rarely identified as a kind of explicitly as a white child. But I think innocence and whiteness go hand in hand, kind of in the public imagination, if we want to use that formulation. And even though, at least at the time, and Sarah Schulman and others have noted this, gay men were racialized as white or coded as white, intravenous drug users or people who use intravenous drugs were not. And that sort of distancing, that sort of effort to separate, right, that has to be understood, I think, as racial, but also spatial, right? So the fact that he's from Indiana, a relatively small town in Indiana, this Midwestern poster child, someone who is not sexually threatening, so heterosexual by all accounts, but also not sexually active. Someone who is telegenic, photogenic, right? And by Midwestern, I mean in relatively rural, I mean not from New York or not from San Francisco, right? And not implicated in the sort of the ills, the evils that sort of are understood to be associated with those spaces. I think then and to a lesser extent now. So yeah, I think all of this goes into this really. It all feeds into this kind of complex narrative or kind of web of signifiers that that emerge during this. And I'm totally mixing my metaphors here, but that very much define this story and how people understand it and how they approach it and how they use it. And I think that those it's difficult because yes, the CARE Act, as we'll probably discuss in a second, delivered much needed federal funding for HIV and AIDS. Also embedded within that were these very assumptions and these efforts such as needle exchange bans, et cetera, that reinforced stigmas and that harm people, right? So yeah, how do you kind of square that circle? It's one that I'm still struggling to square. I I think at least where I ended up in the book is I I see a way in which the Ryan White story can be deployed in a more expansive, more inclusive way. And I don't think it's totally inconsistent with the ways in which people have understood his story, but it's also one that rejects very consciously the idea that he is somehow exceptional or that people like him are more deserving of care and sympathy than the least among us.
Let's talk about the CARE Act, because I just want to underscore for a minute how appalling it is that it is not until 1990 that this act is passed after, I mean, AIDS has been around for a long time by then, but it has been publicly very visible since when was Ryan White diagnosed? 84,
Yeah.
so like that story has been very visible to people. It's been ravaging communities, and it is not until 1990. But as you said, once Ryan White's name gets attached to it, suddenly it's like politicians can't say no to at least passing the idea of funding, but not necessarily actually releasing the funds that go with it. Can you talk about that? What happens with the legislation and then the hangups of not actually getting the funding that is approved?
Right. So yeah, it's not until March of 90 that such a bill is seriously being considered. And when Ryan White dies in early April of 1990, his name is attached to the bill. And even though the bill is relatively popular before, it's his death and his funeral, which is this media spectacle. Michael Jackson attends the funeral. Barbara Bush, the first lady at the time, attends the funeral. It is held in the Second Presbyterian Church in Meridian Hills in Indianapolis. 1,500 people attend. It's broadcast live on CNN. It is, I believe, the lead story, if not just discussed on each of the three major news programs that evening. And I always have to tell my students, that was a big deal. The being on the nightly news was a huge deal. It's still not a small deal, but it back then was a huge deal. Yeah, this is something that everybody knew about. I think there was a poll released the following month that indicated that something like 88% of American adults had heard of this story and heard of his death. So that, I argue, provided the political capital to pass this act, but also it's an act that's unpopular with social conservatives. It's unpopular with the President George H.W. Bush, who begrudgingly signs it into law, but he and his administration note that this sort of disease-specific approach, meaning the fact that it's HIV and AIDS that are being targeted, that sets a strange precedent, and he doesn't like that. And it's an uphill battle to get this funded. And I think the kind of, the fact that the death and funeral of Ryan White were these maybe short-lived media moments that might have gotten the bill passed and signed into law, but once that urgency evaporated, or at least in the minds of politicians or certain politicians, then the need to kind of fund this was less pressing. And this is also happening against the backdrop of economic austerity, of an economic recession, and that leads to these hangups, these delays that you were talking about. And it's not until 1994, and only with tremendous pressure being applied to Bill Clinton when he was running for president, and finally when he ascended to the Oval Office in 1993 and then into 1994, it's only then that funding is secured, and it's still less than people would have wanted. So I think this also gestures back to that earlier question about the good that's been accomplished through this story in that moment, but also the limitations of perhaps the this sort of, I guess, narrow approach to the disease, right? Or to any sort of health crisis, I suppose. So Ryan and his name not only kind of legitimate and enable the passage of this bill, they also enable the needle exchange bans that I mentioned earlier that were put into place, and also unleash or further facilitate the sort of rhetoric of people like Jesse Helms, the senator from North Carolina, who plays a big role in the book, who is seeking to embrace Ryan and to, at least rhetorically and materially, really protect him from what he calls something to the effect of, deplorable activities or what have you, that in his view and in the minds of a lot of people in his camp, these activities led to the infection of Ryan White. They led to his death. So for him, the very idea of passing legislation without punishing the individuals he deems responsible for the death of an innocent, right? That just doesn't compute. And he's even at odds with people like Orrin Hatch, right? Who is, to his credit, a big booster of the bill, along with Ted Kennedy. But they're in the same political party, they're in the same political tradition, one might say, and yet Helms sees Hatch's support of this as somewhat of a betrayal. So I think all of that is allowed or enabled by Ryan's story. I don't think it's, there might be a passage in which I might be misinterpreted when I'm not saying I agree with Helms, but I'm saying that his reading is not totally unreasonable, and his use of Ryan White's story actually is pretty consistent with the ways in which a lot of liberal media and other entities are deploying his story and constructing it. So yeah, all that goes to say that the CARE Act, I think, is indicative of this sort of tangle or this tension that we're talking about here. How do you how do you recognize that this sort of respectability politics does maybe yield some positive effects, right? Or does have some positive effects, while at the same time it's never going to eviscerate it's never going to kind of transcend the limits of those boundaries. It's only as big as people's conceptions of respectability or who is deserving. And that's, I want to sort of, with this book, kind of challenge those boundaries, test those boundaries.
HIV/AIDS, of course, is not in the past. It still exists. And all of us have recently
experienced a major pandemic. And then, as you talk about in the book, of course, also a not quite as overwhelming, but the pandemic of Mpox as well. Could you just talk a little bit about, as you do in the book, about the relationships between HIV/AIDS and how it's ongoing and what we've learned from COVID and Mpox?
Yeah, I am struck by, I mean, it's difficult or maybe not advisable to draw these direct historical analogies as I do, but I think there is something to be said for the parallels between HIV, AIDS, and COVID and Mpox. And it's not as simple, maybe, as some might like it to be. I think in some narratives, well, HIV and AIDS were ignored, and then they were not ignored, and protease inhibitors and highly active antiretroviral therapy came about, and that led to the end of AIDS. That is kind of a dominant, I think, not dominant maybe, but it is a popular interpretation. And the blame is kind of laid at the feet of, not unreasonably so, but Ronald Reagan and George Bush and others. But I think it's an incomplete story because, as you mentioned, AIDS is not over. It's not something that can be relegated to the past or localized in the global South. And I think we have to think more broadly about culprits if we want to think about, who is to blame. A lot of it is structural, as we suggested earlier. But I think that pastness of AIDS, as some scholars have called it, also applies in other epidemics and other crises as well. I think there is this desire for COVID to be over and for it to have ended maybe much, and not that it's over, it's just that people wanted it to end. And that's an understandable sort of human impulse, but also it ignores the fact that plenty of people, when folks thought it was over and today, are still getting sick and are dealing with the effects of long COVID. And within that epidemic, that ongoing epidemic, there are similar hierarchies of victimhood. We saw similar patterns of blame where Asian Americans were targeted, and similar things have happened in Mpox. The same sorts of stigmas that were attached to and are attached to same-sex desire. Those things appeared in Mpox, and with the availability of vaccines for some people, there's this urge to again situate that in the past or in Africa, when the threat exists for a lot of folks, and a lot of folks don't have access to the very therapeutics or drugs that could potentially serve to end or severely limit the effects of these pandemics. But that again goes back to this structural question, right? Why aren't these drugs and therapeutics available for more people, and why are people getting rich off of this? And this is a question that ACT UP was asking a long time ago. It's a question that I think was very much present in COVID, still is, and with Mpox as well, where in which a lot of people don't have access to these drugs or these potential remedies. So yeah, I think it might be overly simplistic, but I do see these linkages between these different historical moments. And in many ways, I mean, they're completely overlapping because none of these epidemics have ever ended.
Can you please tell listeners how to get a copy of your book?
Wherever you get your books, you should be able to get The Life and Death of Ryan White. The UNC Press website might be the best way to get it, but if you want to purchase it at a nefarious online retailer, I think it is on sale at the nefarious online retailer that I have in mind. And my publicity director said it's okay for me to advertise that nefarious online retailer and that it's good for everybody. So maybe not everybody, but So if you want to buy your books there, you can do that.
Is there anything else you wanted to make sure we talk about?
I just wanted to thank you for a wonderful conversation, and I really appreciate the invitation.
Thank you. It was a pleasure to speak with you, and I really, despite the subject matter, really enjoyed the book.
Thank you so much.
Thanks for listening to Unsung History. Please subscribe to Unsung History on your favorite podcasting app. You can find the sources used for this episode and a full episode transcript at unsunghistorypodcast.com. To the best of our knowledge, all audio and images used by Unsung History are in the public domain or are used with permission. You can find us on Twitter or Instagram at unsung__history or on Facebook at Unsung History Podcast. To contact us with questions, corrections, praise, or episode suggestions, please email kelly@unsunghistorypodcast.com. If you enjoyed this podcast, please rate, review, and tell everyone you know. Bye!